critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Casella-Brookins. Each episode, we talk about books, mostly speculative fiction, with a special focus on the thorny, interesting, sticky ones, and we invite writers, reviewers, and scholars to give us their critical takes. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome to the podcast Benjamin Rosenbaum. Ben is a writer and game designer. He's been nominated for the Hugo, the Nebula, the BSFA, and the Sturgeon, and the World Fantasy Award. His novel, The Unraveling, is phenomenally good, and his most recent game, The Ghost and the Golem, is available wherever fine electroludic products are sold. Along with Marian Mohanraj, he's also the co-host of the podcast. Mohanraj and Rosenbaum are humans. Ben, thank you so much for joining.
Hey, my pleasure. I love that poem.
It was I tell this story a lot, but I'd been fighting starting a podcast for a long time, and then I found this, I want to say 6th century poem.
Really? It's that old?
Who was complaining about critics like ripping into his poetry. And I was like, oh, shoot, I have to.
Amazing.
Yeah, as long as there's been.
Oh, that's interesting that he's complaining about critics, because I kind of read it as him identifying with the critic. Like
right?
Self-deprecatingly being like, why do I only want a meal of thorns?
Yeah, I think it goes on longer. I've crafted you this beautiful flower and you're rejecting it. Yeah. But yeah. So today we're going to talk about Fire Logic by Laurie J. Marks. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you what else you've been reading, what you've been thinking about. Anything good?
Well, because because I reread Fire Logic for the podcast, I could then not help reading the rest of the Elemental Logic series. So I've been zipping through them. I was almost, I would say I'm like maybe 50 pages away from the end of Air Logic. I thought maybe I was going to read the whole series before we talked. Before that, I read recently Thistlefoot by Jenna Rose Nethercott, which was great. I had talked with her at ReaderCon, and there were a lot of parallels between that and The Ghost and the Golem. But it's a great. I mean, it's dear to my heart. The kind of shtetl fantasy vibe. And I just picked up from the bookstore, but I haven't started it. Kelly Link's Book of Love, which I'm super excited for reading next. Yeah, before that, I recently also reread the Ancillary series, Ancillary Justice series. Yeah, those are.
I've actually been meaning to come back to those. It's been a minute for me.
And right, exactly. It had been. I mean, it was many years ago. So I really, that was. I don't know if I remember my first reading well enough to compare it to the second reading, but you know what I mean? I feel like there was more. I feel like there was more that I got the second time around, but maybe I just forgot.
Yeah, right. I do. I love that.
Yeah,
I think, is it Joe Walton that says that you haven't really read a book until you've read it twice, right? Like,
interesting.
When you come back through it, like, I don't know, that experience is cool. I keep getting these little pokes to read Lecky because there's so much critical work on her, like so much scholarly work. I think she's at some kind of like intersection where she's like candy for theorists, you know?
Oh, wow.
Because
I bet.
You can do language stuff, you can do gender stuff, you can do like empire and colonial stuff. There's just a lot going on there. So.
Yeah, it's true.
Do you know the comic artist Evan Dom?
No.
Did Rice Boy and Vatu, kind of like early aughts, like webcomic explosion. Then he's continued doing like a lot of really good stuff. But
yeah, no, I don't know.
I just got he had a physical book come out called The Last Delivery. That's this sort of like strange, surreal parable of this little. They're all like strange little dudes. Like none of them are exactly like human looking, but this person trying to deliver this package to this sort of like debauched fin de siècle party going on. It like gets like increasingly kind of like surreal and like hellish.
Wow.
And it was
sort
very,
of
very
Aubrey
good, very
Beardsley.
Good. Yeah. Yep. Totally.
I'm trying to even turn it on the all right.
Wow. Yeah. Dom is like master of the weird little dude and like setting up these sort of strange visuals.
Well, put it in the show notes so I can.
We'll do.
Click.
he also had I talked this book up a lot. It's very short, but I really love. He had this book called the Harrowing of Hell, which is about like the apocryphal 3 days that Jesus is in hell, but it's like using it very subtly, not like maybe ironically, not preachily, but using it to think about the sort of like anarchic or anti-statist kind of runnings in the early Christian church, and like
Oh, wow.
the idea that like
Cool.
this vision of Jesus would find the idea of the religion of Christianity like his hell, and like
Interesting.
it's super super good.
Huh. Wow.
But let's talk about Fire Logic. So this for listeners who don't know, this is a book by Laurie J. Marks. It's the first of a 4-part series called Elemental Logic. The first 2 were originally published by Tor, and then the entire series was later picked up by Small Beer, with very, very charming covers by Kathleen Jennings. Listeners might know her as the author of Flyaway, which is also really excellent. So this the first one came out in 2002, and then the last one, Air Logic, didn't come out until 2019. They're a secondary world fantasy. They have sort of roughly late medieval technology and a kind of magic based on the 4 elements of fire, earth, water, and air, but it's a very different kind of approach to it. Like there are people identified with the fire element, but they're not like throwing fireballs at each other, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, which I love. It's a testament to how brilliant it is, how much I love this book, even though I am really tired of those 4 elements. Kind of really tired of like, oh, it's another magic system about earth, air, fire, and water. Come on. But like it's done so brilliantly that it's just in a whole other level.
Yeah, it's not like something where it's like so subtle that you're like, oh, is there magic going on? I was like, no, there's magic going on, but it's very different.
There's definitely magic, but what's really interesting is the continuum between. So it's basically, it's probably it may be my favorite like magic system in an epic fantasy book in a way. I mean, I chafe against the whole idea of a magic system in a way. Maybe better would be to say it's my favorite magic worldview. Like, you know what I mean? In a way, it's like a magic system feels like it's bolted on. You have some medieval society where people act like this, and then, hey, if they do this thing, it's based on, I don't know, trees. If they, you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like somebody's come up with an idea. And here it's so deeply intertwined with the culture and the way of understanding humans and their sort of philosophy and anthropology and everything. To continue to inform our readers, the gist of it, or our listeners, the gist of it is that it's almost like a personality quiz based magic where it's sort of like it's almost like Myers-Briggs or something. There's 4 sort of inclinations that people have. And in most people, you can maybe, most people are a blur of all of them. And then some people have a talent where they're sort of inclined toward a way of thinking. And then as they get more and more sort of out of balance, and only composed of one of the elements, they acquire essentially magic. But there's a smooth line between, there's some characters in the book who are overtly magic and can cause earthquakes. And there's some characters who simply incline towards a more linear and precise way of thinking or a more intuitive way of thinking. And then in between are these characters that are like, Garland cooks really well. Clearly in Earthblood, is that magic? Like he cooks really well. And so that's a beautiful way that the magic feels so natural and deeply rooted in the world. Often magic systems are framed like there's a reality, which is kind of like implicitly our consensus reality, and then like this magic power lets you break reality. But this is one that feels much more naturally harmonically integrated. It's like that is reality. Reality is composed of these 4 elements, and like extremes of them look extreme, and subtle variations look subtle. So there's no normal operating universe, which is sort of anachronistically projected back from our worldview, and then a magic system bolted on. It's more like I'm in love with that.
I also really like how the abilities and how they kind of characterize like what element people are aligned with. Yeah, it does feel a little bit like a personality test, but it also feels a little bit like, I don't know, all of those things that we have a hard time summing up about how people and minds work, but are definitely part of people, right? Like people just kind of have knacks for stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, like you meet people who are like really good at organizing or just like seem to have like not a supernatural, but just like a good idea of like how to go on a route to get somewhere. Those kinds of things that like people definitely have. And this is just kind of taking that and pushing it more.
It super rings true that you have someone that talents are sort of magical. Sure, Karis can cause an earthquake or whatever, but like it's just as important that Garland can take a room full of angry people who can't come to consensus, and by serving the right soup, get them all sort of in a good mood. Like that's equally a power. Like there's not this sort of separate world of the supernatural that imposes on the world. People just have talents, and it's a wonderful celebration of the diversity of kinds of thinking too. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's very much, it's very interesting to read in, it's both a very queer book. It's a book that's very engaged with, I guess for lack of a better word, neurodiversity. Do you
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
sort of like these talents map interestingly to all kinds of human variation and in a way that's celebratory.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking a little bit through this. This was an odd one, but of do you know Scott Card's Alvin Maker books? That was like,
Vaguely. I don't know if I may have read them back like a million years ago.
yeah. I mean, I haven't felt the urge to come back to
Yeah.
Card very much. They're like this. I don't know what the actual time period is, but like sort of like a reimagining of an alternate colonial America where
Oh
they're,
yeah.
they're
Uh-huh.
people have they call them knacks. And
Yeah,
just
yeah,
people
yeah.
just have these sort of like incredibly potent
Right.
versions of sort of like normal things people can do.
Right, interesting.
Yeah,
Okay, so yes, a similar vibe. Kind of like yeah.
I
That's
hadn't thought of putting Card next to this, but that's really odd, especially with the sort of
how old is Laurie Marks? Because I feel like Card is when you were saying I haven't come back to Card. It's like same, but
hmm
also I have to. I'm 55. Like
hmm
Card was formative, right? Before I
right,
knew what not to,
yeah,
before I knew why I shouldn't go back and reread Card. That's that era. And there's a
hmm
lot of stuff that's sort of in my toolbox rattling around
hmm
from that era of fantasy and science fiction. So I don't know if Marx is
yeah.
maybe
Well,
that's the same
I was
similar.
actually thinking a lot, so I'm so glad that you poked me to read this because this series has been on my list for a long time. And
Uh-huh.
I hadn't got to it, and that's sort of like one of the things I love about this podcast is
Mm-hmm.
like people get to
Yeah.
poke me to read things. But one of the things I was thinking about it, and there's so much to talk about in this series, but was sort of stepping back from it and what it kind of feels like period wise
Yeah.
in science fiction and fantasy.
Uh-huh.
It sort of feels both like really intriguingly kind of like in this mid period between like 80s 90s epic fantasy kind of stuff going
Yeah.
on. It's
Yeah.
definitely in the lineage of people like Le Guin, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, 100%.
And but yet it has a lot of elements that make it feel a little distinct from kind of like what's going on in contemporary fantasy,
Yeah.
where there's a lot of stuff going on right now that is, very queer, thinking about colonial powers, thinking about those
Yeah.
kind of things.
Yeah, and it's certainly a forerunner of a lot of that.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's such a but in a way there's an interesting way in which it's like this is a deeply queer book. So Avery
Mhm.
Alder, who's a game designer who I wrote a game with, has a talk on queer game mechanics, right?
Mm.
And in role playing games. And they the argument is that when sort of the big hulking franchises of the role playing game world were like are trying to be more inclusive. They're like, look, we have black elves, we have
Mhm.
a queer couple as main characters in this arc or whatever,
Right.
and Avery is talking about how there's that superficial level of sort of representation where it's like, oh, some queer characters, these two women are together romantically, that's a
Mhm.
thing. But when you design a game with queer like the thing about D&D is even if everybody in it is having sex with the same gender, the fact that the arc is that you start out with less power and then by violently taking things
Mhm.
away from people and building up an army and a castle, you acquire more and more power linearly. Like
Mhm.
that's a straight narrative. Like it's not,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? Like regardless
Yeah.
of whether who the characters are fucking, there's a more fundamental kind of metaphysical level almost that Avery's talking about. And I mean, I think you could push back against that argument in various ways, but I think this book is deeply in that it's like it's not just that it's full of queer characters.
Mhm.
It's that its understanding of power relations and like
Yeah.
how you fix things in the world is not, it is. I mean, it's no accident that in the world of the book, there's no, queerness is normative. Like there's no, I
Mhm.
mean, like what we would call like there's no which is always an interesting thing. It's a world in which nobody has any particular hang up about which gender people are
Right.
having sex with, except that soldiers aren't supposed to get pregnant. Beyond that, it is interesting, that Karis is this, we'll get into, I guess, I don't know how
Mhm.
much to spoil or whatever, but the fact that Karis is this outsider, this deeply marginalized, like, essentially heroin addict child prostitute from a mixture of like the despised invader race and
Mhm.
some native peoples. Like she's completely, and that everyone around her sees her as initially as being unfit to hold power. Like that is, and then and then the found family that is created around her are the sort of ensemble heroes of the book, and
Mhm.
none of them are always right. All of them are always making messy mistakes,
Mhm.
and their love for each other has to transcend all kinds of difference and kind of sometimes natural antipathy. And like that's even though it's a world in which the fact that that Karras's wife is a woman is not remarkable in that world. But they still are this remarkable outsider marginalized group in this world. And the sensibility is they're not just queer in our terms, they're also queer in Shaftal's terms.
Yeah, right.
Karras understands that winning doesn't just mean beating the enemy. And a lot of people around her constantly are like, can we just go win? And like that isn't winning. Like just being more powerful and subjugating those who you have subjugated does not solve the problem. It just moves it. And that's the heart of the book, really.
One of the things I've been thinking about in a lot of books I've been reading over the last, I don't know, 5-6 years, when I find something that like isn't quite working for me or isn't quite working the way I expect, trying to figure out, okay, is this actually not working for me at like a craft level, or is this challenging deeper structures?
Assumptions,
because it's so easy to fall into like we have all of these like packaged narratives about conquest and triumph and quests, and how stories should look. And when you get something that's not like that, it's like, well, did they not follow their Save the Cat handbook, or are they doing something like more interesting?
And this book is that's one of the things I love so much about it. It is consistently defying. Like it is a deconstruction in many ways of like precisely because it's an epic fantasy narrative in the same way. It's basically the thing is that Le Guin. It's clearly you're right that it's totally a descendant of Le Guin, right? But Le Guin completely resists engaging in a way with. There's never anybody in Le Guin who we want to win the war, right? Le Guin, is definitely have this Taoist anarchist perspective and maybe Odo and Before the Revolution, but like Le Guin essentially has this perspective. She decided intentionally to write about narratives that are not in the Tolkien space, like that are not like our band of heroes with magical powers must go up against the enemy and defeat them. Like that's not like total, like absolutely abstained. And what Marx is doing is like writing a book that has all the thrills and epic scope. I so want a big blockbuster movie of Fire Logic. It has all this scope and excitement and drama and heightened drama of like Star Wars or Tolkien or something, with this Le Guinian sensibility that winning a battle doesn't help unless it's pedagogical, unless it's or about survival or something. But it's you know what I mean. And so it's really engaged with a Tolkien-y book where our band of heroes are trying to use their magic to save the day. It goes there and then it totally deconstructs all of those structures. Like literally. I mean, I don't know how much we want to spoiler, but I'll give I think this is a minor and weird example. It doesn't really spoil any plot. Is between the first and second book, the heroes, having achieved one kind of victory, essentially set up house and take care of a kid for 5 years, to the frustration of many of them, like particularly Sanja, who's like, "Are we not gonna solve the problem that that Shaftal has been conquered and is oppressed and all these?" And they no. And that's such a explicit and overt defiance of the standard narratives. You know what I mean? It's such an explicit decision about what's important.
And it's fascinating to me that like both sides of those are here, right? So like you have people like Le Guin who they don't show you this sort of like the tidy political / magic arc, right? They don't show you the wars being fought and won or lost.
Yeah.
They show you these kind of snapshots of people's lives, kind of in history around it. And then you have your Tolkiens and you have people more in that tradition. Like even though someone like Martin is in some ways pushing back about Tolkien, it's also very much about just like who are the heroes, what are the battles, what are the kingdoms, who's the inheritor, that kind of thing. And thinking back on the Le Guin side, I was thinking while reading this of a lot of other small beer people, but like thinking about like Samatar's Elandrian novels, which again have this sort of like epic thing, but not really following the main where you would think a fantasy book would look. But this kind of has both of those because it has this like anti-epic strain to how the main characters think and talk, but it also has, you do see kind of like what's going on in the kingdom, what the stakes are, what they're trying to do.
Super epic. I mean, that's one of the reasons this is one of my favorite books, is it totally scratches that itch. Like if you grew up on, if you want something that it has these huge epic, if you want like Dune, Star Wars, Tolkien kind of this grand scope in which our heroes are, and by the way, particularly Tolkien and Star Warsy, this ethical dimension, because the
Yeah.
thing about Game of Thrones is a deconstruction of that tradition, because in some sense it, maybe not entirely, and I wouldn't call myself an expert of it, but I feel like the vibe is partly it is rejecting unethical, we like the Starks better than we like, the Lannisters,
Yeah, right.
or whatever. But it's not like anybody, like nobody has their hands clean. Everything's a fucking mess, and it's an amoral universe. And
Right.
it's not to say that not to say that it's completely uninterested in the question of how someone might attempt to be moral, but it's A, it's a long shot, and B, that's not. It's the opposite. That's the thing that's the thing where it's taking some of the vibe of a Tolkien book, but instead of having the good guys and the bad guys, it's like, no, let's talk about the actual medieval world, which was a mess of conflicting loyalties and the thing about this book is it scratches the itch of there being. It's not so much that there are good guys, but the book is deeply concerned with the good, and there is an evil, and the evil isn't a side. Right? The evil, it's not like there are good guys and bad guys because the evil isn't a side. It feels like has this ethical grandeur of epic fantasy where it's like, will the good triumph? Will the good triumph on this grand scale is really what they're talking about. But it also has this mature, I almost feel like it's a ethically grown up. Maybe that's another way to look at it. A, queer, B, grown up. View of war and struggle in which it's like, either everybody wins or no one wins.
Yeah.
That's the actual truth of politics. The good winning has to mean everyone wins. There is no, as long as you think one side will win by triumphing and obliterating the other, like that is the evil. That is evil winning, regardless of which side it is, right? And that's it does, as you say, it mixes these two things, that it's got this epic grandeur of grand battles and amazing magic and like cinematic, and betrayal and struggle and love and, and then it's also refuses to take the easy, we just need to beat the Dark Lord road.
I'd love to read an actual history of the development in the real world of the idea that what war is it's killing all the other guys. Right? Because that's like, I mean, like war theorists back to, Clausewitz and, tons of people know this is not how it actually works, right? That I mean, like that's an element of history, right? And like going out and killing lots of people is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a cyclic thing. I think it's more like, that's a really interesting question, but I don't think it's like, it's, there are throughout, I feel like marbled throughout histories, there are times when you have total war, when you're really like genociding, and there are times when you have these highly ritualized kinds of war, which have very little actual killing, at least in certain, and it often is like in groups and out groups. So it's often like when you are in the American Southwest and it's counting coup, where you show your valor by striking someone with a stick in their chest so you could have killed them, and like that's how you win. And similarly, a lot of times in Europe among medieval knights, like a lot of the battles were like, you knock somebody off their horse, they say, okay, I'll pay the ransom, and then you're like, can I go out on parole and knock another guy off a horse so I can get the ransom, so I can make some money so I can pay you the ransom? And they're like, sure, go. You know what I mean? Like it's almost tag. And then there's other times where the same people are like those same guys who played that game would like just straight up murder a town of peasants,
Yeah, right.
And so it's almost like under what conditions does total war emerge,
But it's one of the things I love about this is having, particularly like, I mean, sometimes it's major characters, but I'm thinking of some of the minor characters like Willis, who's one of the kind of like sergeants or something in the Resistance, who just have this idea that like our goal is to just go out and kill all of these guys. Like that's got to be it.
Yeah.
And wiser heads being like, A, that's going to be super duper hard. And B, that's just going to sort of like perpetuate these cycles that we're in, right?
Right.
And the people thinking
the
about it.
interesting thing is, once they level up the super magic person, it's essentially at some point in the books wouldn't be hard.
Right.
Like it's essentially at some point in the books you could have all the Sainite's heart stop, but that would be the end of Shaftal. Like that would be the end. Do you know what I mean? Like you would have theoretically, from Melissa's perspective, you would have won, and also you would have destroyed everything that, that then you would then only have to come up with a new enemy to fight within. You know what I mean? Would just you could only beat the Sainites that way by becoming the Sainites. Because that's what the Sainites bring, is this ideology of warfare, of winning as killing
as total
enough
dominance.
of the other guy
They submit.
as dominance, exactly, as dominance. And it's interesting that the Sainites, of course, as we learn, like are kind of back into that kind of like. That's not like it's not that the Sainites come from some kind of evil culture either. It's that their situation as like mercenaries who got shafted and this was the only place they could go, and like the only thing, and then they're not taken in, In a way, the original sin of the books, in some sense, of that causes the conflict, is them not feeding the immigrants who arrive, and then the immigrants respond by organizing themselves into a force that's got, like, in their vocabulary, what they used to serve these lords back in Sena, and because they're not taken in, because Shaftal fails at hospitality is the fundamental thing that happens. The only solution that they come upon is, well, then we have to be the lords, right? We used to work for these lords back in the medieval lords we're going to be the lords, so you're our subjects. And then that's all and then they just are willing to ride that horse into whatever atrocity it takes them to, because they're kind of, their back is to the wall. There's no other way. Really, in Fire Logic, they just seem like the bad guys. The Sainites really just seem like the bad guys until maybe near the end of Fire Logic we begin to understand that.
Get a little bit more of the background, I will say the thing about like fantasy tropes, Zanja's origin story, is really horrific with her whole tribe being wiped out. But on the fantasy trope level, I did have to chuckle a little bit, because like, if the prophecy says you got to kill a whole bunch of people to be safe, just don't do it. Like,
right,
it's
exactly.
it never works out.
It's never gonna work out.
You're gonna miss one. Right. You're gonna, the little boy you were supposed to find is gonna get put somewhere.
You're gonna get Oedipus.
Yep.
You're gonna get Oedipus.
It's gonna happen
every time.
Yep.
Yeah. Sure. That's wild.
Reading this, like thinking about this, like in terms of other fantasy. Again, one of the things I like about it is kind of its slightly strange messiness, and the even sort of at the plot level. I don't know how to say this exactly. Like, it is, none of it's like unsatisfying. It doesn't feel like it has plot holes, but it has things about the plot structure that feel a little, I don't know how to say this, sort of like unnaturalistic in odd ways. There's a lot of like mirroring. There's a lot of like people being kidnapped excessively. And the thing about Zanja, for instance, being the hinge of history, where in every it becomes a running joke within the book that she dies in every book, right? Like that's like and sometimes that's sort of explicit. Like there's a way in which sometimes it's like these two things happen that are super parallel. But I think partly because the way, I mean, one thing maybe we should get into, like, one of the things I love is how the talents work. But there's something that's sort of stylized, that's necessarily stylized because the book is so concerned with prophecy. Because the Firebloods do a lot of the heavy lifting plot-wise in the book. And so a lot of the book is sort of about having half-baked prophecies that you don't really understand and trying to intuitively follow them to their conclusion. And so a lot of things are kind of like weirdly, like in a way, like that thing you mentioned about, like, the prophecy says you kill them all because they're going to destroy you. And of course, because you killed them, that makes the one person who survives be the one who's going to destroy you. Like that kind of thing is like, that's sort of inherent in playing around with prophecy. And I feel like it creates this resonance with, allegorically or whatever, this idea that like you have this intuition, but you can't get it to cohere, One of the things I really liked about the way that, because there's different sort of like kinds and degrees of prophecy, intuition, visions, right? Reading the glyphs, reading sort of like the tarot. There's all these different things here. Yeah. And when it seems to be working well, like the Firebloods who are kind of like in tune with what they're doing, to me a lot of it feels less like some magic future television and more like the way that there's just a lot of stuff in our minds that we know that is at a pre or nonverbal level, right? Yeah. That can be hard to get out. Yeah. And it's about these people that are in tune with that. Yeah.
I think that's what makes it feel so realistic, is this smooth line between sort of like intuitive leaps that you can see a person making. Like, people who are good at like suddenly putting two and two together without necessarily being able to articulate the steps by which they got there. You know, like the whole idea of fire, earth, and air logic specifically. Water logic is in a way the weakest, but like it's hard to read these books and not sort of try to give yourself the personality test and be like, where would I fit in this? But certainly with the other three, it feels so natural that you start going like, oh, okay, I know people who are earthbloods in the sense that, you know, they're very tactile, very concrete. They deal in facts. They want to solve things. They have this stubborn like attention to the present, you know, and I know people who are firebloods in the sense that they're sort of intuitive leap dreamers who are making these leaps and these wild conclusions. Yeah, and then I know people who are airbloods who have, you know, this rigorous logic. Actually, this just occurs to me now, but if you watch me and Ted Chiang have an argument, which, you know, we used to have these arguments, and it was very funny because we're both enjoying ourselves, but we think so differently. I'm saying these things I say these things that are sort of provocative image pictures, these sort of epigrammic, sort of, and famously, like, I will be like, I don't know, like, you know, the singularity happened in 1494. And then, you know, and then Ted will always be like, but you don't specifically actually mean, you know what I mean? Like, and then Ted will like unravel. And like half the time he'll be like, I see. So what you're saying is, and he'll construct some like specific, and then half the time I'll just feel foolish because he'll be like, but actually this doesn't, you know what I mean? But it's sort of like there's this two different kinds of logic going. Like I'm being very fire logic in the sense that I'm like, what about this? And then, you know, or making some leap, and he's like, I need to see all the math that got us from point A to point B.
Oh, that's good.
Like, so that I can rigorously. Anyway. But yeah, so I think the magicism feels real because it feels like you know these people, you know, these types of people, and then there's this smooth ride from it being a hunch to divination and prophecy, from it being knowing how to cook really well to, you know, being able to make somebody lactate by placing your hands on their chest. I don't know, like this set of.
I was thinking a lot just about how much the books are concerned with choice and with decision making and how people make decisions and think about it. And that's just something that's really fascinating to me because, I don't know, I think culturally we have such an idea that decision making is a verbal process and you go through and you make pros and cons and construct arguments. But actually, like, I think like in reality, like psychologically, neurologically, that is little tiny bit of icing on the cake. You know, it's everything else is how we work. And so it's fascinating to watch like the way, particularly when you get, you know, in this first one, when you get this kind of like three-way conflict about how things work between Zanja, Karis, and Narina, right? Where and so you have this sort of like a rigid idea of how things are supposed to be, a sort of like more passionate, intuitive sense of how things should be, and then this sort of like feeling it through, you know, more kind of like tactile kind of thing. And the way that sets up this thing that can't quite resolve for a long time with am I allowed to be with this person? Am I allowed to physically be near this person? Am I allowed to like influence this person? And the way that their different takes are kind of like circling that feels very much like the kinds of, when you get into those like weird organizational arguments with people, you know, where you're at an institution or a group that you're part of, and you can't quite figure out what's not clicking. And part of it is
it's about how people are thinking, how people are approaching the problem being fundamentally different. Yeah. And also I like the fact that they're not to the point of caricature, right? Like it's like Karis is an Earthblood who leads with her hands, is forthright, is tactile, is stubborn, like is unmovable, and there's a lot of like talk in the book. But, you know, it's not like at some point she like sits down and has a conversation with Emil when she first meets him, and she's like, what is the point of philosophy? And then like at some point later she's quoting philosophy. Like it's not, you know what I mean? It's not like people are these sort of sealed boxes. I do love the fact, as you're bringing up, we're supposed to be mostly talking about the first book, and one of the things that's really interesting about the first book is how a lot of the plot is this. Some of it's about fighting the battle of the people who are occupying the country, but a lot of it is this internal fight among these friends, and it just also feels very messily, like the fact that if you took away if you projected this from the fantastical realm, if you literalized, you know, if you took away the literalizing the metaphor, if you deliteralized and brought it back to Earth, you essentially have like this friend who's very protective of this other friend, and this new flame that she has, and the friend is like, you can't be together, that's gonna fuck everything up. Like, you know, like, you're not good for her. Like, that you're not good for her. Like, that's another thing that's like really deeply queer about the first. Like, that you're not good for her is the main driver of her plot of Bunch of Fire Logic, and it's also so fresh, right? That's so like it's hard to think of an example where that kind of the magic powers almost serve in the elemental logic books as a way to take the complexities and messiness of and passions of like this complicated found family and have their consequences be at this epic scale.
Yeah.
Right. Like, you know, it's like both.
It's doing interesting things with, you know, obviously we could talk a lot about the queer family dynamics are huge in it, but
yeah,
I think something interesting there connecting this is that it doesn't think about life as being these sort of like plot points that are then like resolved or final.
Yeah.
Like think about like I don't want to make it sound like I think Tolkien is simplistic because I don't think he is. But there's a lot there that like once Aragorn's king, it's like hurrah, he's king, done.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Where this is more like, you know, Narina's whole reason to try to keep Xandra away from Karis is I don't think you're going to be good for each other, and that like that will be a thing that continues, like that like our relationship is a thing that takes place over time, and you know, and like affects other people over time.
I mean, and Narina and Xandra's relationship is so interesting because they essentially become like deeply allies, and never really naturally like each other. You know what I mean? But they work together really well, and they rely on each other, and it's a lot of times it's not like the problem goes away. It's not like we vanquish the problem. Like the basic approach to the world in a way is, as you say, it's not sort of like we crown Aragorn king, problem solved. It's like we have reconfigured things so that we can now make this work. You know what I mean? But on some level, it'll always be with us. And that's kind of feels like this grown up ethics.
Well, so in the first one, you have the Sainites as this fairly faceless, you know, stormtrooper evil kind of force. But the way that the leader of the Chaftal resistance becomes kind of the primary antagonist, right?
Yeah.
Mabin.
Yeah.
As a way of like, without like preaching, without like someone like hopping on a soapbox to explain this to us, feels like this kind of study in the way that violent systems recreate themselves even in the resistance to it, right?
Yes.
And this idea that, you know, having this quote unquote absolute righteous cause has corrupted this person into someone who thinks that the ends justify the means, even when the means are like obviously prima facie like just horrific, right? And that feels like you don't quite know what is the answer to that because you've been following, you know, basically all of her lower level foot soldiers the whole book, right?
Yeah.
And trying and like you get a sense of like, okay, I kind of dig Emil. I kind of like they feel like they know what's going on, but realizing that they both don't have yet the bigger picture of what the solution is. Yeah. But they can also see that this sort of like domineering, hierarchical, violent approach is actually that's actually also not going to work. And I love that little reflection.
But I also like the fact that the book isn't. I mean, it is true that Mabon becomes, you know, the antagonist of the first book, and that's really interesting. Part of it is ends justify the means, but part of it is also like the book is very interesting, as you say, in decision making and in the ways we think, and it's a failure of thinking. It's not necessarily that it's just a failure of empathy. What you might expect for somebody making that argument would be for Mabon to sort of descend into kind of like an ends justify the means, like atrocities, like murdering, you know. But Mabon's intransigence, it's her failure to adapt. It's her failure, essentially the real problem with Mabon is essentially her failure to see what's in front of her face because she's become too attached to her view of things, and it seems logical to her, and she's locked in on it. And you know, and a lot of it is this sort of like, she can't see Karis for who she is. Right. She can't see that there are other possibilities, and that Karis opens up other possibilities. And honestly, nobody can explain it to her. Like the Firebloods have this intuition that things could be different, and the Paladins and the Emil as a Fireblood philosopher has this sense that like there has to be when you're presented with these two alternatives, which are both horrible, instead of picking the lesser of two evils, you need to continue to strive that you need to insist that there must be a third alternative even if you don't understand it. And that, that's the flexibility. That just sounds like nonsense to Maven. Like, in a way, what she lacks is this ability to leap into the dark. And one of the things that happens with Narina, where Narina is, if Maven is the antagonist, Narina is in some sense even though she's fiercely loves Karis and is loyal to her, she's also the enabler of the problem. Like, she's the one keeping things stuck. And essentially her arc in Fire Logic is kind of learning to have humility about her, because as an Air Logic, as the kind of thinker she is, she assumes that if Maven has clear arguments from correct principles, she must be right. And if somebody comes and says, well, there's this other thing, I can't describe it, but it's better, like, that's nonsense. And she actually, because she's willing to trust the evidence of her senses and because she sees what she sees, and she actually is flexible enough to be like, I need to learn how, in a very Air Logic-y way. She's like, I need to learn how to make use of these insufferable fire plots.
Right.
But also she's willing to, enter into community with them. And
that ability to like have in the book that it's not that everyone comes together and says kumbaya and we're all on the same page, but to take the time to set up that there are these very different philosophies and approaches to the world and these very different like physical and political realities in the world. And like, there are some things and some people that are going to have to get vanquished, but that like most of the people that you meet are essentially on the same side, right? And with differing opinions about it. And to get to an end...
Certainly in the first book,
In the first book, and to get to a spot where we're still agree that we're kind of on the same side, even though we disagree, that's so tricky. And it's not like your usual kind of like party building fantasies or like, oh, the elf and the dwarf don't get along, but by the end of it, they've shared a few jokes. That's not how this works, right? Like, Narina still has a very different approach to everything, but
it's like they learn to make use of make use of each other and to understand. Even though they're never going to really understand each other, they learn to. They are forced to be allies.
Yeah.
And it's love is so much at the heart of the book.
Yeah.
Like, the only thing that would make Karis Narina and Zanja ever become allies when they're so different and so deeply opposed to each other is that they both love Karis and they know that each other loves Karis, and they come to understand that Karis needs all three of them, right? And they in a sense they give up, like, there's like giving up pride and certainty for love and possibility is like the heart of the journey. And then in the first book, it's very much focused around that. And is within, as you say, it is sort of within. It's like if the first Star Wars movie in a trilogy was just all about the rebels fighting with each other, basically.
Yeah,
with the Empire in the background. And one of the things I love about it as a series, and not to get too far away from the first book, but is like where most, you were saying about Tolkien is like Aragorn's crowned king, yay, we won. Like, where the point at which most people would end the series because we are now powerful enough to defeat the enemies is like the midpoint of the series. Do you know what I mean? Like, and then there's other enemies and other things that are going on, and and so much of it is about how do you make peace, not just win the war, but make peace, which is a much more difficult and messy endeavor.
I was thinking a lot about The Traitor Bear Cormorant, Seth Dickinson's series. Which is a book, I really, really love and I've talked about on the pod before, but is very much about this, like, an oppressed culture with invaders that have come in with like gnarly ideologies and fighting back. And I really love those, and they're really gritty and they're realistic. But one of the things about that is the narrative focus there is never on characters or cultures that have a sense for like a non-triumphalist solution, right? Like Barrow's just like, I'm just gonna blow them up somehow. And we do get glimpses that there are other things there, but that like Marx is so aware that it's like, well, we just live here, and we're gonna keep living here, and we've got to sort this out. And that sort of like, even though it has both at like the magic level, and I think maybe arguably at sort of the plotty level, it has some sort of like unrealistic elements. It also just feels like, well, it's a place and you got to stay there. And you got to deal with people. And yes, some of the people will die and some of the people will be killed, but by and large, you just have to live here.
It's not that they are necessarily pacifists and they are in a war, but the people who we're rooting for in the book, in a way, are the people who have essentially this understanding that you don't win by, right? That like their victory condition is like a healed Shaftal in which, like in which we're not being sucked into this cycle of violence. You cannot vanquish your way to peace. You can't kill your way to peace.
Yeah, right.
Which doesn't mean you can't also you also just can't necessarily sing Kumbaya and get peace.
Right, you can't peace your way to
right?
peace either,
You can't
necessarily.
piece your way to peace. You can't just be like, oh, I won't fight. Well, that might not work out because there's people have a violent, domineering ideology. But also, you can't just kill them all. That doesn't give you peace. You would then have become them, and at that point, you're be dominating each other. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like and the book is brilliant at depicting what I think is this really mature vision of what it takes, and a fantastical, of course, a lot of it is like, it helps, like, thumb on the scale in the sense that it helps if you've got prophecy and you've got, superpowers and whatever. But I feel like it also rings true, right? It also rings true as it's not that far from Mandela putting on the Springboks jersey, right?
Right.
Right. Like there are times in the real world where you have the sense of like it doesn't, just winning doesn't do it, right? You have to heal.
Well, it's back to that like picture of history thing where like, yes, there are, lots of history is in fact big battles and big groups of people moving around and killing each other and stealing land. But also a lot of history is a bunch of different people living in the same place in between those things and sorting it out in good or worse ways, I don't
know. I can't vouch for the 100% historical accuracy of like that. Did you read the Dawn of Everything? It's one of those grand sweep of history things like Jared Diamond and all those things where, of course, inevitably people who are specialists in the subject matter are going to be like, well, this is a little over, exaggerated or whatever. But certainly there's just like the preponderance of examples for how, because the thesis of that book is really like, we have this sort of deterministic narrative of history, like small individual groups of hunter-gatherers are egalitarian, and then as soon as they have agriculture, they make cities and kings, and then they have wars against each other, they build city walls, and then then you get, I don't know, the printing press, and like the sort of like this almost like Marxist stages of history. Like, of course, now you have a slave society, and it's like that is so much of the preponderance of accumulated evidence of archaeology defies the idea and anthropology defies the idea that there's these inevitable stages.
Yeah.
And actually, it's much more of this wild, complicated set of things, and they're particularly pre-Columbian Americas are the only, in a way, test case we have where a lot of the things that happened in Eurasia, because Eurasia was always in communication, and Africa were always sort of in communication at various attenuated degrees. It's not like stuff from Iceland ended up in Rome and stuff from Rome ended up in China in hundreds of in the axial age. So like that's all kind of so things that we think of as inevitable, like civilizations arise on fertile river valleys, then they build walled cities and stuff. Like there's just, if that was our only data point, that just looks like a law of human nature. But then a lot of times when you look at like pre-Columbian archaeology, it's like, oh no, you could do like potatoes and fish as your basis of your first civilization, and sometimes two cultures like in South America would just like expand and just like not merge, not trade with one another, not syncretize, not have a war, but just move past each other. One in the hilltops and one in the valleys. They just ignore each other, which is like.
Is that called in biology? Is that sympatry? Sympatric?
Yeah, maybe, yeah. But essentially, it's like, why not? Like that's right. Like just occupy different niches, and that's something that. Just because something didn't happen in like the sort of in the narrative history that we're used to, where history goes from Egypt to Greece to Rome to medieval Europe to America, like that was history. Like we have certain like assumptions about how things work, but like that like you know what I mean? Like And anyway, like the idea that as you were saying, like the thing about where total war happens or where symbolic war happens is like all about what like cultural conversations people have had and what things they've been able to build as a way of shared way of understanding the world, and it almost is like where people are literally just trying to kill everybody, they have ended up backed into such incompatible corners that they're not, you know what I mean? Like it's a huge, when people are locked into a huge negative sum game where like they are engaged in self-destruction by way of trying to destroy the other.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
it's like that's neither the natural end state of humans, which only a veneer of civilization conceals us from. Nature's red
Mm-hmm.
in tooth and claw. Like I don't buy that.
Mm-hmm.
Nor is it like the result of some specific evil ideology that's always lurking to take over. I think
Yeah.
it's kind of like this multi-dimensional mimetic landscape, and you've ended up in the worst corner or the
Mm-hmm.
worst two corners where you have this incompatible, like you can't, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And the solution to that isn't that you might be in a situation where people are shooting at you and you might shoot back, but
Mm-hmm.
you should not deceive yourself that that's a solution to the problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like,
Yeah. That's good. I think that's a good time to take a really quick break.
okay, sounds good.
I want to get to that idea that like you talked about like doing a bit of in the unraveling of trying to get that sense of of real I don't even want to say bigness, of vastness of time and history. And it made me in the unraveling, that made me think a little bit about which I want to say it's in 4 Ways to Forgiveness / 5 Ways to Forgiveness, the Le Guin later Hainish book, where one of the characters is a Hainish historian. And, which is this, the culture that has been running for, I don't know, untold millennia, When he's talking to someone else about kind of like how it works, like studying history, he's like, oh, you just kind of pick a little slice. You have you have no chance of painting like a bigger picture. And one of the things you learn is that like trying to make these grand narratives and pulling these grand patterns out is a mistake. The way you need to do is you need get close enough that you can think about a texture.
Which feels that is very interesting because A, daughter of Arthur Krober, right? Alfred Krober, and B, seems very much at the time in which he's writing it like a response to Foundation. Do you know what I mean? Is that not a clapback at Asimov in a way?
Well, and thinking about, you bringing up, Graeber and the long history of, we have this science fictional idea of like, long time, big time, deep time. But we're in deep time right now, and we've been there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there is so much to history that we don't know, and so many patterns we don't know.
Well, that was my model for the unraveling of how big the world is, because I think a good way, if you're looking at if you're making up a world, like a good way of measuring its size is how long does it take a person to cross it, right? Like that's what I wanted, this really big. And of course, I ended up writing mostly just about one little world, like one world in that huge, but that is the backdrop. And even that world is then like 1 trillion people. And so it's, of course I can't really, I can only gesture at the bigness in some ways. Yeah. And I didn't want our heroes to be the little band that like solves everything because they just happen to be at the right place at the right time and either have the Novum or have superpowers.
Right.
I wanted them to be ordinary people in a big world and still have some ethical agency, some like the 50 minutes of fame, whatever, but not,
Well, that whole reason that like we're talking about like these grand schemes and like depth and deep time and distance of culture and stuff is that, when you start actually studying this, even just a little bit, as sort of a, amateur armchair historian, is realizing how those easy reductions of things to plots and simple narratives and simple archetypes is not how things have ever really worked.
Right.
It's always been the, sort of like package that's been sold. Why are we having this war? Why are we doing these crusades?
Right.
Why should you march for this king instead of that king? That's always been these simple little things. And you look at the way that sort of sound bite-ized politics works today of like, how do I pack this down into something, this little simple story that meets the archetypes you already have in your head, and that's how the way the world works.
Yes.
But when you actually look at it, it's really big and weird, and people are doing different things, and that's
exactly.
And the reason that these books feel to me kind of like a bridge between epic fantasy and a lot of the stuff going on now is exactly in that like finding a way to think about the human scale and focusing in on that and that weirdness. And again, not that all epic fantasy misses that, right? Like there's lots of
Yeah.
like weird small moments in Tolkien, kind of zooming
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
But
Sure.
but a lot of the way that epic fantasy worked was sort of in service to the other evil Campbell, right? Like, this like monomythic structure everywhere that we got to find a way to
Yeah.
get. That is how it all
Right.
works. And that's where things like sort of simplistic magic, like FTL,
Yeah.
enable that kind of story, right? Like you can't have
Yeah.
Luke do the Osiris mythology without FTL and the Force, and that allows you to sort of pack this whole universe down into this simple
Yeah.
little fable, and this is
Yeah.
resisting that.
I mean, I do think there is a, yeah, I think there is a, it's interesting that you say that because I do think there is a, I mean, they're not one to one, and you can obviously find examples of, where this isn't true, but like there is something that rhymes, at least, about the care of looking at the world building on this nuanced level where you're not, like for instance, being like, do we need FTL? Could we do something that, and the way of looking at history that way, and looking at not as these grand narratives of like, oh, well, this is a simple explanation, but being like, okay, there's this, as you zoom in, it gets really marbled and complex. This actually just happened to me. I'm working on a project where I think I'm going to write something that's set in Cairo in 1166.
Okay. Ooh.
And
Ooh.
yeah. Which is sort of when Maimonides just arrives in Cairo, which is sort of like I was kind of interested in Maimonides, and I think I'm going to do something set there. And I was just doing a lot of research, therefore. When you asked me what I was reading, this is the thing I left out. I did all this research on the period, and from all these different angles. And what's really hilarious is, so not that many people write about Cairo in 1166, and they fall into some distinct categories. First, there are military history buffs and historians of Islam who are interested in Saladin, because that's when Saladin is arriving in Egypt. And then there's Maimonidean people, like Jews, are interested in the life of Maimonides, and this is like his beginning of his arc, right? And then there's Ismailis, because Cairo in 1166 is the end of the Fatimid dynasty, the only Ismaili Shia dynasty ever, where actually the Ismaili Shia Imam was ruling Cairo. And like most of the time, there's a group of people who most of the time have been minority everywhere, and this is the one time that they had that they were running the show, and it's just at the fall of that. And you're reading these three different, so whenever I find a book, it was written by, like, this is the only way you get grant money to write a book, I guess. The only way you get in advance is just one of these three. So the people, like the Maimonidean historians, are like, well, it was really hard in Spain, where Maimonides was born, and in Fez. Maimonides, for those who don't know, was a great Jewish philosopher, philosopher, jurist, and legal scholar and medical writer of the Middle Ages. Anyway, he was persecuted by the Almohads, and then he came to Cairo. And the story you get there is all like, well, in Cairo was this peaceful, tolerant place in which there was no conflict among the three faiths. And so Maimonides had this illustrious career serving various sultans and caliphs, which is 100% true, very tolerant. Nobody was particularly persecuting the Jews. But it's such a narrow view, because also it was this incredible, like, Maimonides' boss was like, he basically he's the protege of this Muslim guy who manages to seamlessly switch allegiance from the Ismailis to the Sunnis when they come in. But that is really like touch and go. Like they could have all gotten murdered, not for out of religious prejudice, but just because it's a change in administration in the Middle Ages. And like, I don't know, there's just like, the entire place he lives gets burned down in 1167. Like Fustat is put to the torch. It's very funny that people have these different lenses of history, where it's like, oh, peaceful utopia, and it's like, from this other perspective, it's like, yes, and then they burned down his entire city.
Right.
Anyway, but as you zoom in, and the other thing is that I was assuming this very simplistic, like the Crusades, that's about Muslims fighting Christians, right? That's one side was the Christians, the other side was Muslims. But in 1166, when I'm zooming in on, it's like, actually the Shia are allied with the Latin Christians, and the Byzantines against the Sunnis, but the Sunnis have recently also made a treaty with the Byzantines. So it's just like this, it's not what you think, right? It's much more as you say, it's much more weird and complex the closer you zoom in.
That's very cool. This is even more of a tangent, but as a coffee person, I'm particularly
Yeah.
interested in the 12th century Egypt.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is
Is
like
that when coffee shows up?
starts
Or...
like moving around. Yeah.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I have this very specific alt history fantasy that I indulge in, which is like
Uh-huh.
there's this very specific moment in Islam, and then a little later in Catholicism, maybe like, I don't know,
Yeah.
like 2 or 3 centuries later,
Uh-huh.
where they might have both of those religious institutions might have classified coffee as wine.
Oh, wow.
And I have
Uh-huh.
this fantasy of if we had treated coffee that way, like you wouldn't be allowed to get
Right.
it to go. We would be okay with charging more for it. And I think about that all the time.
And I mean, there is this pop history theory. I don't know how much credence to give it, that like the rise of coffee changed life because all of these people were suddenly hopped up on coffee instead of drunk. So coffee houses produce this intellectual ferment.
It is interesting that like in this time period you start seeing revolution everywhere. But yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
But to come back around, and I'm gonna use drugs. Use coffee as a way back in.
Smoke. Right.
Smoke.
There we go.
I wanted to talk about that, and I don't even know what to say about it. I just want to comment on how potent it is. So in Fire Logic, Karis, who we meet, who's like, and like Karis has like really interesting, right, like sort of almost a queer Arthurian kind of vibe in a way, right? Like sort of the destined king in a way, the destined monarch,
sure,
and sort of like smiled on
like
by nature and oppressed by people, but anyways,
interesting,
And she's also just great as a character, and I love her relationships and like her mixture of cultural and personal fragility with the fact that she's also like, physically strong and large.
Right.
And, like, she's just a really interesting character.
Yeah.
But this drug, this smoke, which is it's addictive and it destroys
sensation.
Your sensation. It takes. She's. I mean, I think we'd say she's anhedonic, right? She can't feel pleasure.
Yes. Right.
And it's again, I don't know a ton to say about it, but it's really powerfully done.
Yeah.
And it just, I don't know. I mean, I have had people in my life who have been destroyed by addictive substances, and it's also weird. The book has such a sort of like unmitigated anger towards it that it's not that it doesn't feel justified, but I don't know what to make of it in some ways. And like it's purely it feels like something that would come out of like a specific drug epidemic, like like the cocaine rush, or like the heroin or meth, sort of like epidemics.
Yeah, I mean the funny thing is that it seems very heroin, and like in terms of its effects and like the behavior of its users and stuff, but it isn't, like, it predates the opiate epidemic. Maybe it's more like heroin in the 70s. I don't know. But so it doesn't. It would be neat if you could take the time of composition and match it to some specific. But I don't know if that works. But I do feel like it's part of. I feel like it's really interesting how it's effective, particularly in Fire Logic, at making, and kind of interestingly, sort of in a way, comes back around in Air Logic, at making, as you say, I think there's this play with Karis being both weak and strong. But anyway, I think part of the thing that Smoke is doing is they do have, because Karis has this accumulation of power, and so she's really more powerful on a physical level than by far off the scale than anybody else in the book, even though that is sometimes useless against Air Logic and Fire Logic, depending on what's going on, right? She can be very easily tricked, but she's physically powerful. And not just physically, but like sensorially, like she can, like she has. But so they kind of have a Superman problem. And so in the first book, one of the roles I think Smoke has is making Karis both weak, really compromised, really marginalized, really at the brink of despair and uselessness, and also making her invalid to be Gideon, right? It's the thing that convinces everyone without a second thought, that and the fact that she's half Sainite. But among the people who are ideological, the fact that she's half Sainite is the problem. But among everyone who's just a reasonable thinker, like it's obvious that you can't be Gideon and be addicted to smoke because anyone can control you. Anyone can walk up and tell you what to do. You're docile. Like it's the opposite of it. She's the lowest. And so there is, as you say, there's like something of the hidden king, like the low becomes high. Like, and in a way it's Karis's political education. Not all the Gideons are wise, you know. It's pretty clear that Tadwell Gideon is not particularly wise, right? And so in the later book, the book doesn't just assert that she's wise. It doesn't just assert that she deserves to have this power that the books give her. It shows us her education, and her education is 15 years of being unable to feel. And she's an Earthblood, so her whole, a Fireblood wouldn't mind quite as much because they could live in their fantasy world, but she completely lives through immediate sensory experience, and her immediate sensory experience is like slowed to a trickle.
Yeah.
And she's in this kind of hell, which was imposed upon her, and she both endures it and has the discipline which Narina guides her in, of like, it's very, actually, to come back to Le Guin, it's very Taoist, this discipline of not acting, this discipline of refraining and waiting, and, this practice of humility, which has us believe, when she eventually becomes very powerful, that she doesn't have this arrogance that she would have if she simply, do you know what I mean? Like, I think for the Gideon who just were brought up as an Earth Witch, somebody put the power in them, they're now in charge of everything. I am Shaftal, I speak for Shaftal. You see that when we see Tadwell Gideon, that it's like, of course, there's a huge arrogance there. You know what I mean? And Karis has had this experience of being so powerless that she is suspicious of power, is reluctant to take power, and is also has this sense of humility and constancy, and like that she should listen to the advice of others. You know what I mean? Like that allows her to be kind of more than she is. So I think in some ways smoke is like there to deprive her and also educate her and also nerf her, in terms, right? I mean, and because yes, and I think you're right, probably because maybe Laurie Marks hates addiction.
Yeah.
Like it's a way of talking about evil.
Yeah.
Right? It's a way of talking about.
And it's one of the things, like, I think it does do all of those things, and it's also one of those things that has sat in my mind as this weird, thorny thing in the book, just because it's presented as this absolute, right? Like, if you have smoke once, you're addicted to it forever, and it will definitely kill you.
That's true.
That's true. It presents like sort of like abstinence as the only solution, and
yes, it's a drug with all the bad things about it cranked up to 10.
Right.
Like it's an inexcusable drug. Yeah, which does make it very different. It does make it sort of, I see what you mean. There's a certain discomfort there that it's like she's chosen. It's a bit of a it's a device. If it were an argument about drug, to the extent that it's an argument about drugs, it's a bit of a straw man, right? Because it's a drug that is the worst drug you can imagine, right? But way worse than any Earth drug, right? In some sense.
But this is like not a ding at the book, but just a thing that just stuck with me, was that how much of it is about her wrestling with it and not having a great solution, and feeling like it defines her, and in a way it does define her, like in some ways, and like you can't simply just reject that and say. And then, she didn't choose this. She didn't do it for
it was
hedonistic pleasure seeking.
It's also part of the traumatizing. It's also part of the traumatizing that it was imposed upon her. When she was a child prostitute, basically. Like that was so. It's it's very. I mean, it also serves as a way that she has been both harmed and also humiliated. And in later parts of the book, when people, she is able to say, do you think I wasn't harmed by the Sainites? Do you think I wasn't harmed by this war? Do you think I haven't suffered? You know what I mean? It's sort of like it has this. It's a source of why she's invalidated and disregarded, and later it's kind of a source of credibility in some cases. But it's interesting as you say, like it is a maxed out kind of addictive. Like it's again sort of thumb on the scale. Designed to be the most evil thing.
Well, I feel like I so rarely see the actual kind of like pain and struggle of addiction represented very well, particularly in like speculative fiction, where like you'll have your kind of like stock, like, oh, I got to get clean, and then you just get clean and move on, but like to have someone like for page after page and chapter after chapter just struggling in this thing is powerful.
Yeah, and the way it impacts her relationship with Sanja, because there's this sort of love story in which she's essentially kind of, not just because of what's happened to her, but because of who she is and how she experiences the world, there's this barrier between them, right? Which is they like her being anhedonic is a showstopper for their relationship in a way, and yet they can't, and yet their love won't listen, so they it's one of the reasons why Norina seems to be right and Janja seems to be like a bad idea and they should stay away from each other. And so much of the book is about everyone agreeing that sounds like a good idea, but still not, being able to, I think in some ways the book, one of the reasons that the tensions between fire logic and air logic in the book, part of what it is, it's not that one of them is really presented as superior to the other. They're really presented as interdependent and needing each other. But there is this sense of there is this, as you were saying about how people make decisions, we don't really usually make decisions based on the most logical set of steps. That's a very lionized idea in our culture, because it's a technology humans aren't very good at, that we figured out pretty late, that turns out to be wildly useful for some very specific narrow slice of life, doing, if you have large data sets that you can really quantify and you want to avoid certain kinds of cognitive bias, logic and reason are really helpful in discovering empirical fact, right? But most of the decisions you make in life, particularly ethical ones, they don't really, it's often a real failure mode to think you can approach them in the same way of just being here are first principles, thus I have deduced correct action. And so there's a way in which her, the negative capability, willingness to not know and be fumbling in the dark is really, it's presented, that's another thing, as you were saying about addiction, not just being a quick, oh, and then I got clean, but being this grueling ordeal throughout that first book. Similarly, in plenty of books, it's oh, he just had it came to him, he didn't know why, brilliant flash of insight. But what you have here is this struggle in which people have intuitions that don't make any sense, and they're frustrated by them, and they struggle against them for pages and pages, I have this instinct to do this, but it's obviously wrong, and then it doesn't always turn out, sometimes it turns out, and it's also not like a pat, it always follow your heart, it always turns out to be right. It's really as opposed to either being oh, flash of insight, I thought of the brilliant thing, or always follow your heart, or being or lionizing logic. What's great is she calls them all logics. Yeah. Right? So it's it is another kind of, an incommensurate kind of logic. And that's really how the book approaches this, which is really sort of about neurodiversity, these different types of thinking, all of which need each other, and which are incommensurate, and which the way somebody else thinks often looks absurd to you. They just can't think well. And the book is kind of making the argument that there are these, by showing us these portraits of these characters who just think so differently that it's not natural for them to understand each other, and how they have to work together,
And one of the things about the book, and we should probably start wrapping this up, but that I think is so great is it's not a romance, but it is very much a love story, or love stories plural. And that's very much one of the logics of how it works. And how people's attraction to each other and commitment to each other and struggle to each other. And things specifically, we've barely talked about Emil and Medric.
I feel like structurally Fire Logic is a couple of romances, right? In some ways, the A plot being Karos and Zanja, and the B plot being Emil and Medric, but it does feel like that's the plot architecture is one of romance in some ways.
And it's fascinating that Emil and Medric are, even though they're both fire, they are also both at this intersection of intuition and learned, written, more scholarly approaches to things,
that's
right?
True. Right.
That's a big part of their dynamic. But these books are great. We should start wrapping up. Before we get going, I wanted to ask you if you've got anything you want to plug, anything you want to talk about, maybe a game you've released recently, or anything else you've got going on. Yeah,
sure. Happy to. So, well, yes, the main thing is The Ghost of the Golem, which came out from Choice of Games. and you can play it on the phone or on the browser or in Steam or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's searchable in Steam or like the App Store or the Play Store, and it is shtetl fantasy, as I said. So it's kind of like 19th century. It's set in 1881 in the first wave of pogroms in the Russian Empire, and you have this protagonist who's son of like it takes place over most of it takes place over the span of a few days in sort of your village, which is kind of threatened by both political, human, and also magical troubles. And it's also, there's kind of this overlay juxtaposition between like the sort of magical and political and, the sort of adventure story in which there are golems, as it says in the title, and and mystical journeys and stuff, and also like Cossacks and soldiers coming and whatever. Like that is interspersed with this kind of Austinian social comedy in which you're kind of arranged marriage, kind of Austinian also Fiddler on the Roof social comedy in which your mama is trying to marry you off and to an arranged marriage, and there's all these social stakes in play. And I wanted to really split the difference and make a story which has a lot of room for queerness and difference and also is very rooted in the historical in the 19th century. Like all the Choice of Games titles is a very progressive company, and they always are like you could pick your gender, you could pick your orientation, you can be all these different kinds of people. And most of the authors I feel like solve that problem either by having it in a society without any oppression, like you're in the future or you're in whatever, and there's no like nobody cares if you're like whatever which is great because you get to be those are great, like I love those. But I kind of wanted to engage with like, yeah, but it is different in 1881 if you're a man or a woman. It certainly is different if you're straight or gay or trans, right? So I kind of wanted to actually portray real potential for joy and agency and like triumph without ignoring those differences. And so it's interesting. Like, I don't want there to be any like plot thing you can't do because of gender or sexuality or something, but also like, I wanted it to feel, because I find those narratives thrilling. And really this goes back to a lot of what I drew on was Yiddish literature. And it goes back, Isaac Bashevis Singer, like super, like Yentl is a super queer trans story.
What?
What? And more so in Yiddish than in English translation, by the way. Because,
okay.
Yeah. I don't know. That was a tangent. I was talking about my book, not Yentl. But anyway, I'm just saying it goes back to the source, the sense of possibility and everything.
I've been playing through it, and it is immensely it's immensely fun. And I'm enjoying it so much, and I'm not being taken out of it, but I keep thinking what it must have been like to design and write and make it with these branching and these different versions of things, and just I don't know, fascinating and well done. So listeners, check that out.
Well, that's the other thing. The reason I kind of went with Choice of Games is I was really interested in their model, which is this idea of delayed branching, which is not like the old Choose Your Own Adventure book. So some interactive forms of narrative either look like the old Choose Your Own Adventure book, where you just branch and then you never come back. It's like if you go with you either go with the goblins or the aliens, and if the goblins it's that plot and the aliens it's that plot, which essentially makes them short. Like a lot of times in the old Choose Your Own Adventure books, you just would choose something and then you fall into a pit and die, because otherwise they would have been immensely long since they're not coming back together. And then other interactive narratives are like, well, it's basically one story with some variation. You can kind of choose to like inspect one thing or inspect another, but we're basically taking you on a trip. And this is actually neither of those things. I mean, at least I think it really there are dramatically different endings, but it is kind of like one coherent narrative. It's kind of structured over the days. But I was saying it felt like writing a novel where the protagonist is a quantum superposition of possible protagonists. So it's like there are certain things that are always happening, but who you are can be wildly different. You could be a complete skeptic, rationalist rebel, or a very dutiful, pious mystic, or reshuffle any of those adjectives. And that gradually changes the story so that by the end of it, you could be in wildly different places, and people have told me it's very replayable. So that's that's kind of
cool.
That was really wild to write.
Yeah, this is a much larger tangent. We can't get onto it, but I'm just fascinated about one of the things that, like, I kind of feel like games as a media, as art form,
Yeah.
This is like way too simplistic, but they're kind of doing like two things. One of which is like basically like a new kind of toy, like a new thing to like play with, and it's fun, you know.
Yeah.
But the other thing they're doing is like narratively, potentially they're doing something with choice, and that is like much more intensive at like to be reductive at like a computational level. Like it takes a lot more to put in choices that work. And there's so many games that give the illusion of choice, but always like bottleneck back to a same state, you know, at the end or in between games or whatever. Because otherwise, how do you?
Really, my goal here was every choice should be meaningful. Like every single choice you make, and there are like thousands. Like every should matter. It should never be the case that maybe there's a few times where it's cosmetic, but almost always it's like, no, that does actually always take you on a slightly different path, regardless, push things in a slightly different direction, which is, and I forget which theorist, I heard this recently, but a game theorist who was saying that games are, in the same way that art is about vision and music is about hearing, they're like stylized ways of the stylized limited universe so that we can really see something in a specific way about vision or hearing or whatever. Games are about agency. Games present choices that are kind of delineated choices. Even games like tag or checkers are presenting in a way, defining a field and making rules that allow for simplistic, like this means this and this means this, that then allow you to experience a kind of like agency. Do I do this or this? And so, I think it is. And I do think in these games, I do think that's a weird thing sometimes, is there's sometimes a tension between the storiness and the gaminess.
Oh,
I do think that's
totally.
interesting.
Yep.
I do think that's funny with I think that's true of my game too, that like the artistic challenge was often that I came up against this kind of, and we don't have time, but lots of the beta process and the revisions, the things people push back on, were where it was story-like when they were expecting game-like, or game-like when they were expecting story-like. So there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
But I do feel like it's an art form built around agency.
I'm resisting having an episode about a game just for my own time of playthrough.
That would be great.
but Benjamin, thank you so much for joining. This was a really great conversation. Yeah,
thanks for having me.
I want to encourage people, if they haven't, to check out the Elemental Logic books. I'll put links in the notes. And
great.
Thanks so much. Hopefully I'll catch you around again here sometime.
Sounds good. Talk to you later. Thanks so much for having me.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Barcha Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabrielle Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is very cool of you. Go to patreon.com/ancillary-review to become a backer. Come hang out with us on Discord. If you heard us talk about a book and you want to buy that book, check out our show notes for a bookshop link. We get a cut. Finally, you know the drill. Leaving a review or a rating really helps wherever you listen to us. Sharing our posts on your favorite social media really helps. Telling someone out on the street that you should check us out. I don't know if that'll help or not. It might if they like speculative fiction. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com. A Meal of Thorns is sticking with fantasy for a minute. Next time we are talking about Tolkien's Silmarillion with Eden Coopermintz. That's right, it's Eden from Death Sentence, talking about hope and despair, occasional werewolves and giant spiders, and the distant glimmer of a just world. Real serious stuff. Until then, take care out there. Don't worry about your appearance. Yes, like that's too much. I gotta admit, Ben. Like I am already a little mad that I've embraced podcasting over the written word. And visuals, that's a step too far. Like that's
a step too far.
That's too much face.
Yes, and even the written word really was,
Honest,
even that Socrates warned us.